This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, welcome to episode 101 of A Geek Leader Podcast. And today on the show we've got the Maestro, Roger Nierenberg. And in this conversation we talked about how you can learn leadership through music and through things that you may not relate typically to leadership, but there's lots of great examples for it. So Roger wrote a book called Maestro, The Surprising Story About Leading by Listening. And he goes through this, is a kind of a fictional story with real life events that happened that relate to this. It was just a great book, so I highly recommend it. I read this book, and then I felt like I needed to get Roger on the show, so I reached out and was able to make it happen, and really enjoyed the conversation. He had lots of good insights and things that we talked about. We talked about, how not to underestimate the task of management, leadership, how to not point the finger, how to take different perspectives. It was just a really good conversation. So with all that being said, give it up for Roger Nierenberg. One thing I want to say starting out with, that a lot of people probably don't know because I've never really talked about it on the show, is that I was in band growing up. I was in concert band, marching band, and jazz band, and I was able to relate to this book, just the idea of conducting, because I tried out for a drum major. I didn't get it, but I tried out, and I was able to learn some of the things that you talked about. I was able to relate to my own life and see parallels between music and leading music and managing teams, and especially technology teams and creative teams.
Yeah, well, thanks, John. Conducting is an obvious position of responsibility. You're responsible for much more than you yourself can do. And so it's a really apt metaphor for what all kinds of leaders are called on to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the things I really liked about your book was kind of the idea that, you talked about different groups, like if you were in the section of where the oboes, or you were sitting with the violinist, you had different perspectives and you heard different things, and people had to listen carefully to understand. And there was one part where I believe the maestro said, listen to the flutes or listen to the clarinets, and that would guide you. What kind of impact can that have in a business environment where you're listening to other teams?
Well, actually, that's a really powerful insight, this one, that chapter in which what's happening is the orchestra's playing, and we have this business executive who kind of becomes he's not exactly the student, but he's seeking advice about leadership from the conductor, and he's sitting in on the conductor's rehearsal. And at one point, the conductor asks everybody to listen to the clarinet, and then during the break, he chats with some of the musicians, and they say that was so ingenious what he did, and the business executive can't understand why. And she said, well, most conductors just tell us to shush up. Of course, we're playing too loud, and it never works because we don't know how much softer to play, and so we don't really respond to that. But by listening to the clarinet, we knew exactly what to do, and the orchestra gets very quiet. And then he discusses it with the conductor, and the conductor basically says the connections between a leader and the workforce are never as powerful as the connections between collaborating members of the workforce. And if you can use those relationships within the workforce to transform the work, it's much stronger. So by asking everybody to bring their awareness to a certain point, it strengthens the bonds and the communications within that workforce. And those bonds, once they're strengthened, can be used for bringing about all kinds of changes, and much more quickly and much more lastingly than a conductor can ever do. So for a leader, you realize that if you want to modify the behavior or the awareness of the group, you can directly tell them. But if you can leverage what's going on between the group and have those connections carry your message and bring about those changes, it's much faster, it's more effective, and it's more inspiring for the group to work that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I've seen that in my own career path when it comes to if I tell someone something, yeah, they might get it. They might resent me for telling them. They might not like it when I tell them. But if they learn it from themselves, from trying to see things from someone else's perspective, it makes a huge impact. And that's one of the things I do whenever I'm speaking somewhere or speaking at a conference. I'll try to record myself and go back and listen to it to see what it sounds like from some other perspective other than the one that I'm having.
Well, that's very wise, I think.
Also, one of the things I really liked about, first I want to ask you, did this happen to you as a conductor? Did someone come in and listen, or did you just understand that this concept plays very well with the business world, and I need to share this to help benefit those out there?
I'll give you a kind of indirect answer, which will get there, what you're asking. This incident with listening to clarinet, that did happen in rehearsal with me. And that comment by the musicians, that did happen also. So the things in the book, the events in the book, even the book is in the format of a fable, of a story that never actually happened. All the events in the book actually did happen. But as to how I came to sharing my insights as a conductor with business audiences, I didn't begin from that point of view, and I didn't begin with that goal in mind. My goal really was to expand the audience for classical music, because I felt there were a lot of people whose lives could be very, very greatly enriched by having classical music in their lives. But they didn't feel comfortable with it, and there was a kind of inhibition that they had about it that prevented them from actually experiencing it. And what I was trying to devise was a learning experience which would bring people to the point where they could hear the music and feel the music the way I would, or the way a musician would. And once I started doing that, and I did it for business organizations, then I started getting this feedback about how useful it was, how powerful it was, and how long-lasting it was. And that led me to just simply following where the opportunity was, to doing it for business organizations. And then I started getting these invitations from one organization after another, and that actually eventually led to a kind of a second career. Although in my mind, I don't feel like I'm really doing anything all that different, because it still involves me conducting an orchestra and bringing music to people.
So this whole idea of the learning experience that you came about kind of was a byproduct of getting people to get involved in classical music and to kind of benefit the orchestra.
Yes, exactly. And at every session that I do with every organization, I always talk about that. I always say that, as pleased as I am with the possibility that because of what I and the orchestra did today, you might be more successful in your career. As happy I am about that, the big success would be if you now wanted to go to live symphony concerts, because wow. I still see myself as promoting that.
Yeah, well, as you should. I think that's one of the amazing. I don't know if you call it a byproduct. I guess that's your main goal, was to promote the symphony, whereas the byproduct was that people were gaining all this leadership experience and knowledge from your learning experiences. Could you tell the audience a little bit about how this plays out and how the learning experience kind of goes for someone who's not familiar with it, that hasn't read the book yet?
Yeah, so clients engage me to appear at their meetings. And sometimes the meetings are small as like 20 people. And sometimes it's as large as like 2,000 people. In whatever the case, I engage an orchestra to appear. And the orchestra meets with me for 1 hour. And I always engage the local orchestra wherever it is, be it in Singapore or in Guayaquil, Ecuador, or, all the places in the world that I've done it. And so I'm seeing a new orchestra, and I'm rehearsing them only for an hour. But I don't tell them anything about what the presentation is going to be. So it's really spontaneous. And I don't tell them what's going to happen in it. Now, when the clients arrive, they sit there, the room is set up so that they can sit inside the orchestra. And everybody's facing the conductor. And then the orchestra plays, and that in itself is a new experience because most people haven't had that experience of sitting inside the orchestra. And then I introduce the orchestra as a kind of, not only a musical ensemble, but a place where they can discover things about how to be more successful in their own career. And then gradually I start to ask them to make observations about the orchestra. And then I asked the orchestra to do role-playing exercises. And these are based on the briefing that I've gotten in advance about what the client organization is trying to accomplish, what I call their success picture, which I've asked them about, and I feel confident that I understand it. And so we do some of those, but I've also asked them about what the challenges are and what the barriers are, what the impediments are to their achieving that. And I model those as well. Sometimes I model them and sometimes the musicians model them. So within 20 minutes of the thing having started, people begin to realize that by listening to the orchestra, it's like looking in a mirror and seeing themselves. But they see themselves more clearly than they do in real life. And that's because real life unfolds at a speed which makes it hard to connect the dots. So that, let's say there's some dysfunctional and damaging behavior that happens, but by the time the results of that behavior have arrived, it's so far away that people don't, it's hard to connect what caused that. But in music, because it moves so fast, the change in behavior instantly produces results, and the results are audible to everybody. Not only are they audible, but they can see in the body language of the musicians what that behavior has done to the group. So looking through this lens of the music, suddenly they see themselves much more clearly than they have. And at the same time, I can introduce some of the behavior that they don't really know about themselves, and they're not very happy to acknowledge because it's their dysfunction. And they can see it play out in the orchestra and the effect that it has, but nobody gets defensive about it because I'm not saying I'm now going to show you something about yourself. I'm all the while just showing them things about the orchestra. But people, on some level, they understand and they can absorb the kind of criticism and the awareness much more easily than they would if they were told about it, because nobody really likes hearing that message of that you could be better than this. Some of the stuff you're doing is interfering with you. It's much easier to use your own awareness and to come to that conclusion yourself.
So what was your journey like starting out this like, what was the first one like? What was the first learning event? How did that go? And what was the idea behind not telling the orchestra what was going to happen?
Well, I knew that some of the behavior and its results in the orchestra would be hard for people to hear. And so I knew that I had to interview the musicians for them to talk about what the effect would be. For example, if I asked the orchestra to get territorial and to adopt a kind of zero-sum attitude, so that if anybody else sounded good, that was somehow you were losing something. I knew that if this was canned, it wouldn't be believable and wouldn't be realistic. So it was important for me to make sure that it was spontaneous and true to the orchestra, so that when I interviewed them about it, they would be able to talk in a kind of an honest way. And, when in any audience, for any of these kinds of leadership things, or these, learning events about management, there's always a kind of skepticism in the group. There's always people are skeptical about whether I'm going to learn anything. Is this going to be useful? And do these people have anything to teach me? Especially when it's something that's so far removed as an orchestra. And But my sessions are extremely disarming. And by the middle of the session, everybody is completely bought into it. And part of the reason is that the musicians' reactions are they're so honest, they're so real, they're so humorous, and they're so articulate about it. And this is a great surprise. And so even the most cynical people get caught up in that. And I think all those reasons lie behind my decision to do it this way, to make sure that the orchestra itself is not only a participant, but that they're learning things about their own environment that they don't normally think about. They know, but they don't think about them.
So have you ever heard any stories from someone that participated by playing an instrument in the orchestra, of something that they got out of this that they didn't expect from the attendees, the business leaders that were in the event?
Oh, it happens all the time. And at the end of the session, when I give both workforces a chance to interact with each other, I ask the business participants to introduce themselves to the musicians. Those conversations are so lively, and there's so much curiosity across that divide that it's obvious that that's happening. But in addition, I hear lots of stories from the musicians. Well, they don't really talk to me that much. I don't encourage that, because for me to talk to the musicians, ask them questions about what they experienced, it would be kind of like a little violation of their autonomy and their privacy. And I respect that. But I do hear stories about people saying that they got insights about things like being parents and family situations and other kinds of situations. And then there's this insight about themselves at work, and especially about the power that they had, or that they can perpetually have, but they don't realize, and therefore they don't exercise it. And very commonly workers default into a kind of passivity of just doing what they're told, and that robs them not only of their joy at work, but also of the productivity that they could have, and the innovation that they could bring to their work, and the feeling of control over their own destiny. All those things are big insights for the musicians as well as for the executives.
I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that I've noticed when leading technical folks and creative folks is, if I tell them what to do and how to do it, then I'm robbing them of the ability to innovate and be creative of their own, and they may surprise me with some ideas that I wouldn't have thought about.
Right, exactly. I completely agree with you.
And another thing that I really liked and really kind of related to pretty heavily with the book was, you talked about when you did a guest appearance at a school, and you were teaching the other conductors, and one of the conductors was kind of like reacting to the rhythm more than he was reacting to what was about to happen in the music, what was about to happen. And that was one of the things that I thought about when it comes to leading people, is we have to prepare ahead of time. We have to respond to what we expect to happen versus just constantly reacting. And that's one of the things that I think I may have fallen short on sometimes, where I'm more or less playing a reactive game instead of a proactive game. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure. Everybody understands when you're driving and you have somebody who's, let's say, reading the map and giving you directions, that there are some people who make that process very easy. And there are people who make that process extremely frustrating and difficult and dangerous, in fact. If the directions for when you're supposed to turn or what you're supposed to do come with the right timing, they're easy to execute. But if they come with the wrong timing, and normally it's generally too late, but often if it comes too early, it's annoying, because you don't want to hold that direction in your mind, because by the time you get to the execution of it, you might have forgotten it. And whereas that example is very, very clear, and we know that experience, surprisingly, when we're in leadership positions, we tend to forget that. And we're not sensitive to the timing of the direction, the relationship of the direction to the timing of the execution. So in the book, the lesson for the student conductor who has this problem is, the maestro who's teaching says that the conductor and the orchestra exist in different time zones, and that the conductor has to get comfortable, that your thinking and your living is much more about the future than the future of the execution than it is for where you are. And you get very comfortable with that, and then it creates much less frustration, and it creates much more accuracy in the workforce.
Yeah, and I remember in the book, the business leader was constantly, he was talking about how in his meetings he kept referring to the past instead of talking about moving forward.
Yeah, well, of course, it's much easier to look at the past and draw conclusions from it and tell people, what went wrong. That takes much less talent than it does to digest what happened and then try to extract lessons from it, and then to impart those lessons in a way that people can benefit from that. So leadership demands a lot of skills, and they're not necessarily the same skills that you would use as an individual contributor. And the fact that people who are excellent individual contributors get promoted into leadership positions and then they flounder there, and they cause frustration, they cause conflict, they cause politics. It's all because of the lack of understanding of what this new role is and the skills that are required. And what I found is that what I learned about orchestras and conductors they're great lessons for any kind of workforce.
I couldn't agree with you more. And, that kind of happened to me. I was an individual contributor, and I was, I thought as a pretty good engineer, and got promoted into management, and my first role of management was terrible. I had probably the highest turnover rate in the company. People were quitting left and right, and I kept trying to find reasons and excuses for it, but I never looked back at myself. I thought, well, maybe it's because of how I'm leading the team. And there was a few things that came to me and it made me realize that, I'm not leading properly. I'm not communicating properly. I'm telling people what they did wrong all the time and not actually giving them direction of where to go. Yeah. And I think your points that you've made in this book about being able to let people learn from themselves, pointing them out in the direction ahead of time, and not just throwing out what they did wrong all the time, made so much sense. And the idea of different perspectives for from a musical standpoint of where you sit and standing up on the podium where you can hear everything come together really made a whole lot of sense.
And then what people never tell you when you become a new manager is that the higher you go, the harder it will be to get the truth from anybody. Because once you have the power of evaluating people and in their jobs, they start relating to you in terms of what they can get for themselves, which generally does not include telling you the truth about what you're doing wrong. So it's something that you have to really be hungry for as a leader, to understand what kind of behavior works and to train yourself to do that, and also to find a way of troubleshooting, of turning the clock back and playing things forward, playing things again, in slow motion, and looking at exactly what happened, and then trying to discover whether your behavior played a role in causing the dysfunction.
Yeah, very good. If you could tell the audience a little bit about kind of how you got started conducting, and maybe what are some of your big mistakes that helped you learn how to be a great leader.
Well, there's so many mistakes. There are thousands and thousands of them, and I'm pretty good about remembering them. So when I was like 10 years old or so, I started playing in the school band, just like you. Mm-hmm. And I discovered this kind of ecstatic feeling of this kind of energy, this pure energy that was just incredible. And shortly after that, I discovered the Beethoven symphonies, and there was nothing else that my life was going to be about. That was it. And then, so I learned about music, and I finally decided that's what I wanted to make my profession. Now, there was a second part to what your question was.
Yeah, what are some of the mistakes that helped you learn to become such a great leader?
Well, for example, the first time I conducted a big orchestra, I think I was 16 years old. I was at the National Music Camp in Interlochen, Michigan. And the conducting teacher there, I was taking a course there. He was conducting that concert. And at the end of each concert, the orchestra plays this Interlochen theme. It's kind of one of the distinguishing differences between that festival and other festivals. And so he called me up in the dress rehearsal to conduct that. And that was a complete surprise to me. And I stood up in front of the orchestra, and here I am conducting this thing. And I couldn't believe how heavy the orchestra felt. I couldn't move them. It just was so hard to get them to move forward. And that was my experience of it. I couldn't get them to play in the tempo that I wanted, and then I couldn't get it to move. It was so slow. I didn't realize that was my first experience of what we were just talking about, of my conducting in the kind of future time zone. And I was conducting in the present time zone. In effect, I was telling people what to do at the same moment that they were supposed to do it. So it was no wonder that the communication was breaking down. So that was a big lesson. It took me a while to understand what it was, but right at the very first experience of conducting.
So that kind of goes back to your map example of being that guy sitting in the passenger seat and saying, take a left now, take a left now. You just missed it.
That's right, exactly. Well, I wasn't criticizing people. It was clear to me that it wasn't easy for them to follow me. And even though my gestures were good, but the timing of the gesture was wrong.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for leaders that are kind of not in those multiple time zones, but they're focusing only on the past to get them to think more about the future?
Well, I guess one piece of advice is kind of self-serving, in that I would suggest that they might read my book. But let me see if I can do something right here and now. So I think the first thing is to have be quite demanding with yourself about discovering what a good direction is, and to have a clear differentiation between what is a criticism and what is a direction. I remember at one point there was an inexperienced stage director in a Gilbert and Sullivan production that I was the music director for, and he was giving directions to one of the actors, and the actor said to him, "You're not giving me a direction, you're just criticizing me." And I thought about that, and I realized that this director, the singer was right, and the director hadn't learned that to distinguish between what's criticism and what's a direction. A direction is what tells people what to do. Criticism is what tells people what was wrong. And it's much easier to criticize than it is to direct. Giving directions requires more thought, more wisdom, more reflection, more seeing the big picture. And so I would encourage people, first of all, to learn how to give good directions and be very self-critical in that way, and try to discover what makes for a good direction.
I think that's really good advice, and it's hard to do sometimes to figure out, how can I direct someone versus criticize them. And I think one of the things that I found that kind of helps me out is, instead of pointing out what they did wrong, point out what they could do right.
Yes, that's good, and that's the first thing, and then figure out what the right timing should be. When is the right time for that direction? Because the right direction at the wrong time is a wrong direction.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You don't really think about that, but we go back to your driving example. If I told you to take a right, a block before you were supposed to actually take the right, then you went the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. And then you might say, well, why did you do that? Well, you said to turn right. Yeah, but I didn't mean to turn right then.
Exactly.
And it's so easy to criticize the result of that interaction and the person who has their hands on the wheel without realizing that actually there's a lot more responsibility that lies with the person who's giving the direction.
That's really good advice. Do you have any other tips or pieces of advice that you would give to new leaders that are out there that maybe this is their first time managing, their first time leading folks, and they're in that same boat that we talked about of being that individual contributor that just got promoted and doesn't really know what they're doing wrong yet, that you could share?
Well, I would say, first of all, don't underestimate the task. Just because you were really good at something doesn't mean that you're going to be good at managing other people as they do it, and that you are in effect a kind of a beginner. You're not a beginner in the skill that you share with the workers, and you think because you've done all these things yourself, and you've been so good at it, well, that now you're in a position to lead people. It's not that easy, and it's not a situation where your mistakes are going to come, that you'll notice them. Other people will be making mistakes because of what you do. And so to embark on a study of what good leadership is. So that's a general piece of advice, but I think it's helpful if people realize that this is difficult. And I'll give you just one example, because a client of mine has asked me to invent an intervention for people in hospitals, because you have people who are the residents, and you have people who are the new doctors, and 1 year they spend doing a lot of the detail work, and then the next year they get promoted, and now they're supervising and overseeing the people who are doing what they used to do, and they find that it's so different. It's such a different skill. And you're so much more in contact with the real world difficulties of dispensing healthcare. Like, for example, the irresponsibility of patients, the ones who don't follow your directions and don't do what's necessary and can't really take care of themselves, something that you're not even aware of when you're just carrying out the directions. So that there's a whole training around that. It's kind of automatic when you make that shift from being an individual contributor to being a manager, that you're going to be confronted with this, and that nobody's going to be criticizing you about it anymore, and nobody's going to be teaching. That you have to become your own teacher.
That's really good. That's a really good point. That you kind of have to take ownership of that, right?
That's right. That's exactly. I couldn't say that any better. You have to really take ownership, and you have to take on responsibility, so that when things go wrong, your first question is, what did I do? Mm-hmm. Did I have a role in this?
Yeah, and that was one of the problems that I think I had as a new leader, is I kept trying to find someone else to blame and didn't realize that I should be pointing all those fingers right back at myself.
Yeah, finger pointing is the first instinctive reaction. I remember a friend of mine told me a very humorous story. He had just moved into a new apartment in New York City, and he was there with his wife, and they hadn't moved in anything yet, and they came into this new apartment, no furniture, everything, and they were looking around, and suddenly the door closed, and they realized at that moment that there were no doorknobs yet installed. And they were locked in to this new apartment with no telephone and no way of communicating with anybody, and they were locked in. So I said to them, "So what did you do?" And he said, "Naturally, each of us blamed the other for why it happened or how it happened." And that's just a normal instinct to point to somebody else. It takes more maturity to start looking at yourself and what you could have done.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that's one of the lessons that I had to learn, is to think there's always something more that I could do to prevent this or to improve the situation, and that's what I need to be focusing on, not focusing on who was at fault.
And at least to learn lessons so that you become better for the mishap having happened.
Exactly. So how can people learn more about your book and the music paradigm and the things that you're involved in?
Well, that's the easiest question you've asked me all morning. There's a website, which is musicparadigm.com. And on the website, there are videos and there are blogs, and there are a number of things that people can look at. And there's a way of contacting me. You can learn something about the book. So that's what I would recommend.
All right. Well, I'm going to link that up in the show notes. I'm also going to link to the book in Amazon and the Music Paradigm as well. And all that will be linked up at geekleader.com, so you guys can go there and visit, and feel free to check that out. I highly recommend the book. I've already gifted 2 copies of it since finishing it up last week, and I plan on gifting some more.
Well, I applaud you for reading it before the interview. Not everybody does that.
Well, I think it's important. I think it's important to go through that process because, for starters, you get a lot out of reading books, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of leaders don't do. They don't spend time developing themselves and learning that stuff. But also, before you talk to someone, it's good to have context. That way you can get the most out of it.
Well, that's good leadership on your part. You know, you don't have to be in a leadership position to exercise leadership. Is there time for me to tell one anecdote?
Well, absolutely, yeah. Take your time.
So this was told to me by a business consultant. And I don't know whether it's true, but it ought to be true if it's not. But the story is about one of these situations at the airport where there's bad weather or some kind of delay, and there are these people who've been there for hours, and they've boarded the flight, but then the time of the crew expired, and they had to come back to the gate and get off the plane and wait for a new crew, and everybody's in foul mood. You know what that's like, and they're standing around complaining and everything. And one guy, he disappears for 15 minutes. He comes back with 48 long-stemmed roses. And he says, "You think you're upset. My wife has been at the airport where we're arriving, waiting for us, and this is our anniversary. And it's a big deal for her, and I feel really bad about it. So would you take one of these flowers? I'll describe her to you. And when you come off, just hand the flower to her and say happy anniversary." Well, people started taking these roses, and then they started talking about, their families and how they fell in love, and the whole energy of the people at the gate, it changes so that when they announce that it's time to board the flight, they didn't realize that the time had passed. And then when they finally arrive at the destination, they were in such a hurry to get there. But they, one by one, they come off the plane and give his wife the rose, and then they don't leave. They want to wait because he's the last one to come and give the 48th rose. And they're all applauding. And that is leadership. And you don't have to be in a leadership position to do that. At all times, you have the power to exercise a kind of I would call it's just the leadership of making things better for other people. You don't need authority for it. You don't need any position. It's an option that you have at all times.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I kind of learned that when I read one of Simon Sinek's books, and he talked about the fact that you can lead from any level. Leadership's not a title. It's a mindset.
Exactly.
Well, this has been great, Roger. I really appreciate having you on, and thank you for your book. It's been impactful for sure, and I'll definitely share that with more people in the future.
Thank you so much.